A very warm welcome to Improving Our Classrooms and our very first webinar on our new digital model. To start your IOC journey, we're going to look at the big picture today: international, national and local research and policy. But before we start, I think it's really important to reflect again on the fact that teachers are the ones that are going to make a difference. And that's why it's brilliant that you're all committed to improving our classrooms, and we're really looking forward to working with you. If you look at this graph, it's quite stark the difference that a teacher can make. If you look at the top, the 90th percentile down to the 37th percentile, that clearly shows you the difference that a high quality teacher will make. The bottom line showing the students with low performing teachers, and the top line showing the students with high performing teachers. So you being committed to IOC and being committed to being the best teacher that you can be and improving learning and teaching in your classroom really will make an incredible difference to the children that you have in front of you in your class. And we really look forward to working with you on IOC.
Okay, so now we'd like you to consider the big picture. We would like you to consider Scotland's place in the world in terms of education, and as part of your pre-task you'll have already asked yourself that question. The reason we ask that question is that we want you to be inquisitive, to inquire, to challenge, to question those claims that can be made, that there are systems and processes and practices in place that are working effectively well to raise attainment in our children. Now, part of your task was to consider the national context. And in actual fact, what we're asking you to do now is to consider the international context. What we ask is we look beyond our own borders for the most successful education policies and practices, and while we will consider and take into account fully our national context, it's very, very important to look up and look beyond, as we say, those borders to see what is happening out there in the wider world. Now, where do you think we are in the world? Where do you think our place is? How are we performing? How are we ranked? Have you considered that before? Because I think in considering that, you will start to then think of improvement being influenced by these very, very important pieces of research that are out there about our education system. It would be wrong to focus just primarily on our starting point, just be our own class or our own school, or even nationally. We have to look internationally. But where do we go to find that information? Where do we become that inquisitive and inquiring mind that we're asking you to be? Where do we find that information? Where we find that is in something called PISA results. PISA. We love an acronym in education, and this acronym, when we would ask, we would normally say, does anyone know what that acronym means? And from some of your responses earlier, we are aware that some of you do know what this acronym means, but largely it's something that's perhaps not always been an influence on your practice. So PISA is a programme for international student assessment. It is an assessment of 15-year-olds in 3 key areas, and that is reading, maths and in science. It takes part every 3 years by the OECD, which is the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and there are countries that participate. There's 79 countries that participated in the last round of assessments. These assessments take place every three years and are then published in a document which explores a wide range of data that doesn't just come from those three key areas. It actually gives us a wealth of information that we'll explore as we go on and think about PISA and how we can use these results as a means to improve in our classrooms. PISA is probably the most comprehensive and reliable indicator of student capabilities. You will meet people who will criticise PISA and who will perhaps challenge that, and I would suggest that's the people who are perhaps not too happy with the results. But in actual fact, it's a very powerful tool that countries and economies can use to fine-tune their education policies. It's very much about looking to see what the good practice is out there, and that is fundamental what we ask you to do in IOC. So we're doing it on a larger platform here, we're doing it on an international level. It was set up in 2000, so has been running for 20 years now, and over those years there have been an increasing number of countries that have taken part. The last round of assessments, there was 79 countries that have taken part, with over 600,000 students involved in that. And as I've already said, those are 15-year-olds, and it's a sample taken from across the countries and across schools. But as I say, it is a very reliable indicator of student capabilities. Why 15-year-olds? Well, you may say we're primary. Why 15-year-olds? Well, those 15-year-olds were sitting in our classrooms not so long ago, and we are part of where they are at that age and that stage in their development. And again, the wealth of information that it gives us, we have to take account of and we have to look. And the OECD produced this report, as I say, not only in the three key areas of attainment, but also in areas such as our children's health and well-being, their mental health. We get real key information on gender. We also get key information on immigrant attainment and immigrant children in our education systems, which also ensures equity. And we can respond to this kind of data to ensure that equity. But also, very interestingly, it gives us an insight into socio and economic disadvantages or advantages for our students, and in terms of their aspirations, their career paths, and their even their parental support that we get. So we really do have a wealth of information here to take into account and to consider what we can do in our classrooms when we look to see what is working. So the results are published, and of course there is a ranking. There is results that show some countries outperforming other countries and in key areas. And I think it's important that we look to see where are we in Scotland, where are we featured, because more often than not, you perhaps have thought we were performing in a particular way, but it's perhaps just, I guess, it's perhaps just an inkling. And perhaps not really got too much more insight into the other countries that are performing particularly well and that are consistently performing and ranking very, very high in the PISA results. So I would like to take you through that and use this information that we're going to find out here as perhaps your starting point for your case study for improvement. You may be well informed by what's happening in Scotland, or indeed the wider world, in terms of education, in terms of what this document tells us, PISA, about education today. And again, we will remind you later in the webinar about one of our key documents, which is our How Good Is Our School For? And you know that the approach to how good is our school for is very much that we as professionals look inwards to ourselves, and we will do that on a national level when we look at Scotland, but then we look outwards and we will look to the other countries and to see how well they are doing. But then, of course, for you, for improvement, for your case study, you look forward. How has this informed your practice? How will this shape your practice? And how will this help shape your case study for improvement in your classroom? Your classroom may be a reflection of what is going on nationally, and you perhaps want to use international evidence to make that change within your classroom. Okay, so here are our results. As I have said, PISA has been gathering this data for 20 years now, almost, and you can see we have attainment over time, if you like, something that we do in our schools, but we have that for our Scottish schools and our performance. So you can see here clearly from the graph here that we have information for our reading, our maths and our science. I would like you to just consider that graph for a second. The impact of that. Is it what you first thought? Is it what you would have expected? Is it something that has shocked you? Because the OECD average is 487. This mean score here, as you can see, is how the assessments are scored and presented, and how we judge the schools from the mean scores. So at the moment, the OECD average is 487, and if you look, you can see the data here, where Scotland is decidedly average. More so, more concerning, in fact, is that there has been a significant decline over the years in our performance in our Scottish schools. We can see that in comparison to countries at the moment whose scores, if they are high-performing schools, high-performing countries, then with high-performing schools, their mean score would perhaps, for example, China at the moment is 555 in reading, for example, 557 for both maths and science. So at one time in 2000, Scotland would absolutely have been holding its head up high to be in the top ranking countries in the world. That has significantly dropped, as you can see. There was in 2015 what we call the big shock of 2015, kind of akin to the Wall Street crash, where we were at our absolute lowest in terms of our performance. There was an expectation that that would increase, and again, when you consider later on in the webinar with all of the key policy documents and all of the things that we have put in place since 2015, perhaps we would have been looking for a wee bit more of an improvement in our performance. Our government said in 2015 that we must continue. It made difficult reading, is what they said. It made difficult reading, but that we must continue to make the changes that are necessary to strengthen Scottish education. What were those changes? Are you aware of those changes? Would you regard those changes, if you're aware of them, And perhaps further in the webinar, you will be aware, perhaps more so, of the things that have been put in place from around that date. And would you say that our Scottish education system has been strengthened? There is a slight increase in reading, which was celebrated, absolutely celebrated. And I suppose we need to consider the reasons why. Why was there that increase? What was it that worked? What was it that didn't work for science and for maths? Because it is at its all-time low. In terms of where we are now, in summary, we are performing slightly higher than the OECD average in reading, and we are performing around average or slightly below average in terms of our maths and science. I would ask you if you would be happy to be average, to have an average school, to have an average classroom, to have average attainment, to be an average teacher. I would like to think not. And I would like to think that part of your reason to be here is that you want all of those things to be above average. But how do we do that? We have to look a bit closer in terms of our performance, because Scotland always did have a reputation of being a very, very strong education system. In terms of our home nations, we always outperformed England, Northern Ireland and Wales. In actual fact, what you can see is that is not the case anymore with our attainment. In terms of reading, we're slightly ahead of Wales and Northern Ireland, but for the first time we're consistently year on year, for the triennial year on year, we are behind England. As a nation, we have never fallen behind our English counterparts, and particularly not in reading. So at the moment, although we're ahead of Wales and Northern Ireland, but slightly behind England, we look at maths, and for the first time we are also behind not only England but Northern Ireland. And again, it makes very, very difficult reading, as our Deputy First Minister said, it makes very difficult reading. And we can see again from here that we are slightly below average in terms of where we are placed in the OECD. Here we look a bit closer at the individual 3 areas assessed, and I think it's important to explain that what is assessed are skills of reasoning, interpretation and problem solving. So they really are quite high level, quite high order skills that we all want for our children. They're aspirational. So again, credibility there for our PISA assessments, and because that is what they're assessing. Again, to reassure that the data is reliable and robust, it's a culturally neutral assessment, and does not give an unfair disadvantage or advantage to the students from the vast number of countries that participate in PISA. So when we look at our own particular results and scores here, and these are the mean scores, and you can see that grey block along there is a very sort of average of OECD, which gives us again the stark picture of where we've fluctuated over the years. And again, bear in mind that the high performing countries are up there in the high 500s, 555, as I said, for some of the provinces in China. And countries that have been on a very significant upward trajectory in terms of the results, countries like Estonia are sitting around 523. We were above them at one point, and a country that we're looking to now, we should be looking to now, to learn from. What are they doing in their reading that is giving them such a high ranking? So that gives us some stark information there around that. Now, of course, we are not minimising that slight increase in reading. Of course, we recognise it. I think what's more important is that we can understand why, what was the impact. And again, that's something for you to consider. What has the impact been? And I'm sure the Deputy First Minister would perhaps suggest it was his reading challenge that perhaps supported that. But again, as those teachers with those inquiring minds, we would ask that you look closely into any intervention and ensure its validity, and to be very clear on what has made the improvements. And that's something that we can look closer at when looking at PISA scores and results. So while it looks like there is that increase results in reading, in actual fact, in all countries and economies that took part, we still saw girls significantly outperforming boys. So while we are celebrating that slight increase, what we then, and this is what I mean by being an inquiring mind, this is what I mean by delving in and challenging those results and not sitting back and saying that's great, we are on an upward trajectory like Estonia. No, we have to then say, well, what more? And what more is that our boys are still being outperformed by girls in reading. That's a challenge for us in our schools. That's a challenge for us to look at other countries, but in actual fact, all countries that participated in PISA, girls are outperforming the boys. There's the data there. It is there, of course it's there. So even in those high performing countries, less so in countries like China and Japan and Hong Kong, less so, but still significantly, an average to the questions that were asked, because as I say, it was about attitudes and things. PISA asks attitudinal questions and gathers that information. In terms of attitudes, there was only 24% of boys from the results in 2018 that would have said that reading was in actual fact a hobby of theirs, compared to just over half from girls saying that yes, reading was a hobby there. So that's the level of scrutiny we ask you to apply when you're looking at improvements or looking at data or looking at figures. Look and see what more to this is there. And in actual fact as well, so we have that gender gap, and this is something that we've known probably since way back in 2000, that there's a gender gap. There's a gender gap nationally. There's a gender gap internationally. Does your classroom reflect that? Is there a gender gap in your classroom in attainment? Look at the data around reading in terms of your boys. Is it that engagement? Is it that attitude? Is it the quality of the teaching and learning going on around reading? So you can see from international, we are going and focusing so much so that we become more tuned into what's happening in our classrooms. Another consideration, because we're talking about gaps here, is the relationship between socioeconomic status and reading. And again, this is significant because the disadvantage and in their results was that their performance was weaker than the OECD average. So our children that are sitting there in this data that were from a socio-economic challenged background did not perform as well as the OECD average. So we start to consider things like this when we get into looking at our data in a closer way. Again, we look closer at our statistics around maths, and remember that this has been quite a sharp decline here in maths, and as you can see there, in 2018 it was similar. It's been pretty stagnant since 2009, despite the number of interventions and things that we have all been using in our classrooms, in our national context and in our local context. Despite that, we have a pretty stagnant performance here in maths. Now, there are some positives here, and again, when we look at gaps and when we scrutinise the data a bit more, we consider things like disadvantage and socioeconomic status and gender and so on. And one piece of encouraging news that we get from PISA is that the gender gap in maths is less prevalent. So our girls are not being outperformed as perhaps traditionally was year on year, then that gap has closed and girls are absolutely holding their own in maths. So that is something to be celebrated, but also asks us the question, well, why are we still having this rapid decline in our scores in maths? And again, with the interventions that have been put in place. So in terms of maths, very much an OECD average, and when we look to high performing countries, maths sitting around and again in the high 500s, in some countries 591, some of those provinces again in China, some of those 591 scores there, and again Estonia up and coming, 523. And what's interesting to know about Estonia in terms of that, we have invested significantly in areas of curriculum, particular areas like maths, but Estonia's investment in their curriculum is 30% less than a good number of other countries that are participating in PISA. So again, look to Estonia, look to the countries that are performing well, are on that upward trajectory, and find out what it is that's working there for them, and to make sure that you have all of the rounded information that you need when considering this information. Okay, a very, very busy graph here for you to try and interpret. And if I can just explain, so this is about proficiency levels. So a PISA test has levels, and you can yourself go on to the PISA website and see examples of the test. Take the test. There is an adult version of the test that the OECD also use in terms of developing our social and economic areas in our countries. So it could be an interesting exercise. But this here, average, if a child attains level 2 in the PISA assessment, then that's considered to be average. And obviously high ranking is level 5 and level 6. So you can imagine countries that are at the top of the ranking, like China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, Estonia, have a greater number of children that are performing at level 5 and level 6. You can see Scotland here in bold, and again, to interpret that, it just gives us the message again that we are average, that we are very, very average. And when we look up at level 5 and level 6, we don't see too many of our children in that bracket. To put it to you in a context, the type of questions that a child would be asked at level 2 are not that difficult, they're not that challenging. The questions would be about things like the main idea of a text and being able to interpret that. Level 5 and level 6, I don't think, again, is beyond some of our children's capabilities, because it's asking questions around the difference between fact and opinion and an unread, unfamiliar text. I mean, so that's the type of question. So PISA is not an assessment that is particularly challenging or difficult or like that unfair. It's not. It's asking those questions. And in actual fact, because our country performs average, we can only say that 1 in 4 of our children attained level 2. Only 1 in 4. And only 1 in 10 of our children attained level 5 or level 6 in the PISA. So it is interesting to see like this, and it is again reinforcing the message that we all have high aspirations for our children in our classes. We all want them to do the best, and when it's presented to us like this, then this is when we do want to seek those opportunities to have that improvement going on within the classroom and to establish the right interventions for our children. So while our previous slide saw Scotland up there and perhaps the top 5 there, and with a relatively low number of children performing below level 1 or at level 1, it's not the same picture for mathematics. It's not. You can see that we're significantly further down the rankings, with a significant number of countries outperforming us here, and concerning when we know what we know now about our home nations and about Wales and just about some other countries that I can see there. Again, the first time England is outperforming us is there, but other countries, Portugal, who experienced an economic crash, again it makes difficult reading, and again sitting only slightly above the OECD average. But again, what's also significant here is there's a higher number of our children performing less well, performing poorly and below level 1 and level 1, and less so performing level 5 and level 6. And again, we remind ourselves at this point of what the skills are that are being assessed. And it's the skills of reasoning, it's the skills of interpretation, and perhaps here when we're looking at maths, it's the skills of problem solving. So it's not just the rote counting and simply remembering the facts. That's not what PISA is assessing. So we have to be very mindful of those skills and the importance of those skills in terms of our children and how we can support their performances. In conclusion, and back to where is Scotland's place in the world in terms of education, we have to appreciate that as a country and a government, we want to be judged on an education and a system that's deemed to be world class. Then it is not perhaps the best news that a major piece of research like PISA suggests that we are still very much average in the categories that are assessed, and that there has been that decline over the years. I would ask you to consider now why Why have we had that decline? If we look again back at the original graph, why has there been that decline over the past 18 years? But I also ask you to look and to be inquisitive, to inquire, to challenge, to analyse and scrutinise those other countries. Estonia, Europe's newest education powerhouse, outperforming all European economies, including United Kingdom. And what is it about them? To challenge, to think, to consider the provinces in China, because only 4 of them, and some of the rest, the other 12, are actually only performing average in terms of OECD and the PISA results. So differences like socioeconomic issues, strong economies in some areas and some countries and not so in others. In terms of our own country, spending on education is relatively high compared to the average across larger economies, but not so of Estonia, as we've said, because the 30% less on average they spend on their education. But again, a country that encourages and has a lot of studying for many, many hours, like some of the Asian countries, and in some of those countries, children in school on Saturdays being hothoused. So with every piece of data, evidence, research that you do, we ask that you challenge that, and that you, in your practice, in your classroom, take our country very much out of the average bracket, and seek to get that excellence that we're looking for in the high quality teaching and learning in our classrooms.
Okay, you've heard about PISA and the learning and all the interesting things that happen in the world, and that we can take all these ideas to make Scotland a really, really good place to learn, where we're really given the highest quality education. So it's important now we move to the Scottish approach to education and have a specific look at the national context and the policies and procedures that we need to be thinking about in terms of our country to make sure our children reach their potential in school. For the purposes of IOC, we're going to look at 6 key drivers presently affecting Scottish schools. And you'll come back to these. You don't need to read them all at the one time. We'll give you an overarching idea of the content of them, but over the IOC journey, it'll be good if you can make yourself more aware of the content of them, because you'll use these in the first section of your case study of improvement when you're thinking about the rationale for your project, and you'll be looking at that from a global, from a national, and from a school perspective. So it's good that you make yourself aware of these, and what we're going to do is take you through them one by one and give you the key notes that you would need to know and some key learning and some tips to focus you on your professional reading as you move forward. I want to take a look at the OECD report, Improving Schools in Scotland. That's the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. This policy review was commissioned by the Scottish Government 2015, and the agreed purpose was to inform the ongoing development of educational policy, practice and leadership in Scotland. And what it was an independent review of the direction of the curriculum for excellence and the emerging impacts seen in quality and equity in Scottish schooling. It focuses on the cycles corresponding to the broad general education, so basically primary 1 up to S3. And it's about highlighting the key impacts of the approach taken to the curriculum to date. So that's looking at curriculum for excellence. And one of the tasks we're going to give you later, and which we'll be looking at in more detail in webinar 2, is to get you to reflect on curriculum for excellence. So it'd be very useful for you to have a look at the OECD report to see what they say, because we're going to ask you to look at the progress that's made between the 2015 when it was written and when it was sent out to now being in 2021 and where we are, and we're going to be asking you to look at any progress that might have been made. It was to analyse the key aspects of education policy and practice in Scotland and integrate insights from PISA, which you'll have already heard about this afternoon, and the evidence from other different countries and regions, and make sure that we were looking at the wider world and the successes in education to make sure that we were using all the research to improve Scotland to the highest quality we can. It's finally about highlighting areas where further change or development could add value to the ongoing programme of educational improvement. It'd be good if you could have a look at this one. It's quite a thick document, so we're not expecting you to read it all. But if you look at the summary at the end of the sections, then this will give you a good understanding of that review that was done with a view to thinking about where the curriculum is today. One of the things to note is, and have a look at what it says about the 4 capacities, because the 4 capacities in Curriculum for Excellence is something that was absolutely highlighted as being really good practice. And if you think about it now, we've just had our refreshed curriculum, which has a real focus on the 4 capacities. So it's interesting that this is something that was highlighted in 2015, and we are now looking at that as part of our refreshed curriculum and refocusing on it. So it's about thinking about where that is in your classroom and taking the learning from the OECD and what it said about Curriculum for Excellence then, and really thinking about your classroom and where we are as a country now in terms of Curriculum for Excellence. Okay, moving on to the National Improvement Framework. This was launched by First Minister Nicola Sturgeon on the 6th of January 2016, and it's one of the most significant policy developments in Scottish education over the last 10 years. The framework sets out a vision based on achieving excellence and equity for all learners, regardless of social background and circumstances. The publication sets out 4 key priorities that everyone in Scotland should be working towards, and it's particularly important that you're aware of these priorities as you start your IOC journey and looking for priorities towards your case study of improvement. These are improvement in attainment, particularly in literacy and numeracy, closing the gap between the most and least disadvantaged children, improvement in children and young people's health and well-being, and finally, improvement in employability skills and sustained positive school leaver destinations for all young people. The framework identifies 6 key drivers of improvement, and progress across all of these is needed to deliver the improvements we want to see for all learners. These are school leadership, teacher professionalism, parental engagement, assessment of children's progress, school improvement, and performance information. The framework is being delivered through a joint programme between Education Scotland, the Learning Directorate and the Scottish Government, and in relation to specific drivers, other national partners such as the General Teaching Council for Scotland and the Scottish College for Educational Leadership. In order to drive excellence and equity, in 2018-19, advice was issued on school improvement planning to ensure partners work constructively to create a meaningful improvement plan. This was an important resource for schools to ensure they're working with parents, carers, partners, and their local community. Schools should engage with all stakeholders with a particular emphasis on parents and carers to create a shared improvement plan. And it's really important that you remember this as part of your case study of improvement, and in particular include parents in your work. This increased emphasis in partnership and partnership approaches is intended to achieve greater impact on young people's attainment and achievement. And we need to remember that the impact of parents, it can be huge in children reaching their potential in our classrooms. The priorities of the National Improvement Framework should be central to your case study of improvement. You'll hear us say over and over and over again that you as teachers have the potential to make the biggest difference in achieving excellence and equity for all learners, regardless of social background and circumstances. You know your learners, and with high quality data analysis in your classroom, and we'll guide you with this throughout your IOC journey, you'll be able to identify a key area of learning and teaching which will lead to raised attainment for targeted learners in your classroom. At this point, I'd like you to guide you to the updated National Improvement Framework and Improvement Plan 2021, Achieving Excellence and Equity. And please make this part of your professional reading, because this is something that we would want you to mention in the first section of your case study of improvement, where you give a rationale for the choices that you've made in terms of your improvement project. This is one that I know that you will all be aware of, the Scottish Attainment Challenge 2015, which is about achieving equity and educational outcomes with a focus, as we know, on closing the poverty-related attainment gap. Equity can be achieved by ensuring every child has the same opportunity to succeed, and as teachers, we need to make sure that's happening in our classrooms. The First Minister launched the Scottish Attainment Challenge in February 2015 to bring a greater sense of urgency and priority to this issue. I've already spoken to you about the National Improvement Framework, and it's underpinned by that, and Curriculum for Excellence, and Getting It Right for Every Child, which I'll go on to speak to you later. The Scottish Attainment Challenge focuses on accelerated targeted improvement activity for literacy, numeracy and health and well-being in specific areas of Scotland. It supports and complements the broader range of initiatives and programmes to ensure that all of Scotland's children and young people reach their full potential in school. One of the things from Scotland's Improvement Challenge that we constantly talk about is closing the gap. But to be able to close the gap, we need to know what the gap is. And in IOC, one of the things that we're going to be asking you to do is to identify the gaps that are in your classroom to be able to close them and target interventions for your young people. Have a look at this slide just for a couple of minutes and have a wee think about it. You'll see the light pink on the bottom is quintile 1, so it's our most deprived, and the darker colour on the top, quintile 5, which is our least deprived. And what you can see from this is that everybody is improving. And what you see in the middle is the gap. And what we need to make sure is happening is that that gap is reducing. But if you look at this graph, you can clearly see that everybody is improving, but the gap itself is not reducing. So that's why we really need you to look at the data in your classroom and be very specific and take one child at a time in terms of how they can improve, and be very, very specific in using your data for improvement. Thinking about that gap, here's another example for you when we're taking deprivation into account, because this graph shows the average tariff score by the end of S5. And if you focus on the red bars, that will show you the national data. And it's very clear in this that everybody's improving, which is really, really good. However, there remains a significant gap between our least and our most disadvantaged pupils, and that's something we still need to keep a focus on, and we'll be looking for you to keep a focus on in your improvement project when you really target interventions based on that really good data from your self-evaluation. Okay, Pupil Equity Fund. In order to support the National Improvement Framework and its clear priority to improve education in Scotland, the Scottish Government has allocated additional funding directly to schools to target closing the poverty-related attainment gap. The pupil equity funding is being provided as part of the £750 million Attainment Scotland Fund, which will be invested over the current parliamentary term 2016 to 2021. £250 million has gone direct to schools, or will go direct to schools, between 2020 and 2022. Funding of more than £250 million to close the poverty-related attainment gap and learning during the coronavirus pandemic has also been allocated to schools. For the first time, PEF allocations have been confirmed for the next 2 years, and the reason for this is to give security and certainty to head teachers so that they can plan ahead to make sure that young people are reaching their potential in school. The national guidance is intended to help schools plan how they will most effectively invest their pupil equity funding allocation to improve educational outcomes of children affected by poverty. It's allocated to schools on the basis of the estimated number of children and young people in primary 1 to S3 registered for free meals under the national eligibility criteria. However, although it's allocated on this basis, head teachers have the discretion to make the decision about which children and young people would benefit most from any intervention or approach, whilst keeping a clear focus on delivering equity. The funding should be focused on activities and interventions that will lead to improvements in literacy, numeracy and health and well-being, leadership and teaching, and families and communities, who are very important partners when determining the interventions and approaches and should be very much involved in these decisions. At school level, it's essential that head teachers use their data to understand which children and young people would benefit from targeted support and monitor and track learners' progress over time. Schools should articulate clearly defined outcomes to enable progress and impact to be measured. If you're not aware already of what your school has and what the allocation for your school is in terms of pupil equity allocation, then have a discussion with your head teacher, because it's important you know this again on your journey for improving our classrooms and your case study of improvement. Your case study of improvement should reflect these priorities and your school improvement plan through you using the data that is available to you in the classroom. Even at the early start of IOC, if you have not done so already, try to find out about pupil equity funding, relate it directly to your project and line it with the school improvement plan, because this shows that you have a really good understanding of the most important national priorities at present. Okay, so we've looked at the OECD report, we've looked at the Scottish Attainment Challenge, and we've looked at the National Improvement Framework. And it's now time to really get into our school and think about how we can do this in our school and how we can make these improvements that are looked for by the Scottish Government to make sure that we're making Scotland a really good place to learn and making sure that we're letting children reach their potential in our classrooms. And that's when we go to How Good Is Our School 4, version 4. There's a distinct difference between version 4 and version 3, because version 4 has a particular focus in the classroom and it's written for you. And if it's something that you're not already using, then we would really very, very strongly advise you to start looking at How Good Is Our School now, because we will be asking you to reflect on the quality indicators in How Good Is Our School in later webinars as part of your journal work. Higgius 4, there's a real focus on self-evaluation and improvement, and it's really there to promote effective self-evaluation, because you need that, and that's the first step towards improvement and self-improvement for a school. Higgius 4 has a real focus on closing the attainment gap and the achievement between the most disadvantaged and their peers. There's a really strengthened focus on equality, well-being and skills for learning, life and work, as well as positive destinations. These are key aspects of Curriculum for Excellence, and we'll be looking at Curriculum for Excellence in much more detail in webinar 2, but there are strong threads running throughout the quality indicator framework in Higgius 4. So it's really important that you realise this is a document for you in your classroom and really lays out really clear guidance as to the expectations that we're looking for to provide the highest quality learning and teaching. You'll have seen in the last slide the words, how are we doing, how do we know, and what will we now do? And that's going to run right through your IOC work, because that's going to be 3 sections that will happen in your improvement project. So it's something really important for you to start thinking about. And Higgius 4 is all about this virtual cycle of improvement. It would be good if you could make yourself familiar with the quality indicators, in particular 2.3. Look at the level 5 illustrations, use these features of highly effective practice and the challenge questions, because these are really good in terms of the expectation that we require in schools for really high quality learning and teaching. We're going to look at this in much more detail later on in one of the webinars, but it'd be good if you get a chance to start to look at this, make yourself familiar with it, and I hope that some of you are doing this already, just to make sure you know what you're doing, what the expectations are. And it's also a tool that we'll use in improving our classrooms to let you find out the areas that maybe you're not so good at. So it'll highlight the things that you are good at and the things that you might want to improve. And we will use this self-evaluation document because it should be in the classroom to really help you to make improvements. Thinking about health and well-being now and GIRFEC, so getting it right for every child. And there's not really been a time like the present that we really need to make sure that we're getting it right for every child and making sure that they're supported to absolutely reach their potential at school. GIRFEC supports families by making sure children and young people can receive the right help at the right time from the right people. And that's probably the most simplistic way to put it. The aim is to help them to grow up to feel loved, safe, respected, and so that they can realise their full potential. And we as teachers need to make sure we've got a real focus on getting it right for every child and the health and well-being of our children to make sure that they're in the right place and they're equipped with the right skills to be able to reach their potential in school. Most children and young people get all the help and support they need from their parents, their wider family and their community. But sometimes, and we know this especially, as teachers, that unexpectedly times children do need that wee bit of extra help. And we see children for big periods of the day and we can notice little things that change. And it's really important that we get the children the support and care that they need. So GIRFEC's a way for families to work in partnership and get support. So we need to know that we can reach out to partners such as health, psychological services, social work services, and work together with them to make sure that our children are progressing and they're learning and they're skilled in the Shinari indicators so that they're safe, they're healthy, they're active, they're nurtured, they're achieving, they're respected, they're responsible, and they're included. So this is something, again, that we really want you to take into account because health and well-being is important for every child before we start to look at numeracy and literacy and raising attainment and achievement for them. We need to make sure that they are supported to be in a position to be able to do that. So in terms of your improvement project, please have a wee refresh, have a read over GIRFEC and the principles of GIRFEC to make sure that we're keeping them close to our heart, especially at the moment when we're living under such challenging times.
Hi everyone. So you have just listened to Louise talking about the key drivers nationally in Scottish education. And in this next section, we will look more closely at our context of Glasgow and how our policies link in with that national picture. So starting with Glasgow's population, in 2018 it was estimated as 626,410, which is the highest of all 32 local authority areas, with 16% of Glasgow's population being children aged 0 to 15 years. The total number of children attending schools in Glasgow is 68,750, and that includes primary, secondary and additional support for learning. Within Glasgow City Council there are 140 primaries, 30 secondaries and 41 ASL schools, and that includes schools with a language communication resource. When we look at the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, of the total school-aged population in Glasgow, 58% live in SIMD deciles 1 and 2, which are the most deprived. And this again is the highest level in Scotland. Of all the children across Scotland who live in decile 1, the most deprived area, 35% of those attend a Glasgow City school. So that really paints a picture of the high level of deprivation that we have in our city. Glasgow has 16.5% of all school-aged children who are looked after in Scotland and 68% of all asylum seeker and refugee children living in Scotland as well. 33.3% of Scotland's children with English as an additional language attend schools across Glasgow, and 82.3% of those pupils are not yet competent at English. So that means that they are new to English or at the early acquisition or developing competence stages. So, taking Glasgow's unique context into account, Glasgow's Improvement Challenge is a holistic strategy for raising attainment and achievement for all children and young people and incorporates the Scottish Attainment Challenge. The work streams of Glasgow's Improvement Challenge work collaboratively to deliver a wide range of high-quality, evidence-based initiatives in primary and secondary schools and early years establishments across the city. This includes strategies for literacy and numeracy, physical activity and sport, and expressive arts, with a shared vision for raising attainment and achievement for all. Glasgow's Improvement Challenge includes 5 main strands and aims to raise attainment in literacy and numeracy through targeted support and interventions in primary schools, improve children's health and well-being through nurturing approaches and increased participation in physical activity and sport, support families to be better able to support their child's learning and development, to enhance the leadership of senior staff, and to raise attainment in secondary schools through providing additional supported study, mentoring, and the development of learning and teaching. So Glasgow's Improvement Challenge began in 2015 in line with the Scottish Attainment Challenge and is now into phase 5, with the Attainment Scotland Fund having been extended beyond the initial 5-year period. In the primary sector, where the fund initially focused, it's been used to provide additional staffing for 120 of Glasgow's 140 primary schools, and that's based on the percentage of children living in the most deprived postcodes and also taking into account local knowledge. This additional staffing was provided to designate a teacher as a challenge leader of learning, or a CLOL as they are known, over and above each school's staffing allocation. However, with additional funding through PEF, some schools have added to their CLOL time. They possibly have more than one CLOL, or have been able to appoint their own CLOL if they are not a school who receives Attainment Scotland funding. So that means that all 140 primary schools are now involved in Glasgow's Improvement Challenge plans. The role of the CLOL, many of you will know who the CLOL is in your school and have worked closely with them. Their role is to take on a leadership role in their school for supporting improved pedagogy and targeted interventions with a focus on literacy or numeracy. And some schools are fortunate enough to have a CLOL for literacy and a CLOL for numeracy. So Glasgow's strategy for improving numeracy and literacy across primary schools is a 2-pronged approach. So there is Glasgow Counts to raise attainment in numeracy and Literacy for All to raise attainment in literacy. In session 2020-21, 110 schools have a literacy CLOL and 93 have a numeracy CLOL. All CLOLs attend Glasgow Counts or Literacy for All CLPL, which is provided by the Leaders of Learning team based at the Royston Primary School Hub. And it really focuses on high quality, evidence-based approaches to raising attainment. And following the training, CLOLs deliver staff CLPL and facilitate the implementation of new approaches within their school. The role also includes collaborating with colleagues through modelling, team teaching and peer observations within and across establishments. CLOLs are supported to collect, analyse and evaluate data to identify areas for improvement and impact of the interventions within their school. So you can see that there's really a focus on raising attainment in literacy and numeracy for target groups, but also a real focus on building capacity amongst staff across the school. So particularly for the first section of your improvement project and really finding the focus for your case study of improvement, it's really important to go back to your school and find out, what does Glasgow's Improvement Challenge look like in your school context? Do you have a literacy or numeracy CLOL? Maybe speak to the CLOL and find out how they have identified their target groups. What skills and strategies are they focusing on? Because your project might be tying in with some of those aspects. Thank you for listening to this webinar on the big picture, looking at the international, national and local research and policy. It's time now to return to the post-webinar discussion, and please remember to tweet your thought of the day using #IOCWP and tagging @IOC Glasgow WP. Thank you.